James Rattling Leaf, who is a member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe, is a global Indigenous consultant and principal of the Wolakota Lab. He serves as a guide and inspiration to organizations to work more effectively with Indigenous peoples and traditional knowledge for a more equitable world. And Gwen Bridge. Gwen is the founder and principal of Gwen Bridge Consulting and is a member of the Saddle Lake Cree Nation. She has been working for over 20 years with First Nations, all levels of governments, and the private and nonprofit sectors across North America to advance reconciliation and the implementation of Indigenous knowledge. Without further ado, I'll pass it over to Gwen.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you all for coming and being part of this, and thank you to my colleague James. The workshop we did was a really deep dive and intensive in the information I'm going to try to present here today in concise format, which is not the format I prefer, so bear with me. There's a couple foundational concepts we heard this morning about some of the efforts and understanding that's evolving through our colleagues in academia, in government, and in the private sector to understand what it means to begin to acknowledge and respect and understand an Indigenous worldview, what traditional knowledge means, what Indigenous knowledge means, what is Indigenous law, how do we understand it in the concepts, in the context of our own understanding from an American, a Canadian, a North American, a colonial perspective. So I'll attempt to come through and explain some of that through the Indigenous lens. In Canada, I work a lot on reconciliation, this idea of how we really begin to reconcile what happened and where we're going. And reconciliation fundamentally means this resolution of conflict. And so how do we begin to understand what is that conflict? What are those roots of conflict that we need to reconcile? And I think that's the ongoing exploration of those of us who have been working on this and those of us who are more recently interested because of recent ecological imperatives, legal imperatives, and moral imperatives to address this question. So, yes, let's see, this goes forward. Okay, so I'm going to talk briefly about understanding Indigenous worldview. When you go and you hear, well, Indigenous worldview, when you seek to begin to try and understand Indigenous worldview, I'll offer one small tidbit of information about what that might be, what an Indigenous perspective on what you need to understand should be if you're seeking to work with Indigenous people in the resolution of some of these deep questions like the climate and biodiversity crisis. We heard in the earlier panel about the economic considerations and the ramifications of decisions made or that need to be made to resolve these crises. And I really want to emphasize that in terms of, we won't talk a lot about it, but the need to present these Indigenous solutions, I would say, James pointed that out, not nature-based solutions, Indigenous-based solutions, right? And how are the economic rationales for supporting Indigenous-based solutions important to begin to generate and communicate? This is a real sort of highlighted by this notion of biodiversity and the sort of modeling of biodiversity credit development on carbon credit development. This is a big challenge because we're looking at, and we heard earlier about monitoring and stuff like that. And if indeed, like the IUCN says and others, that the solution to these crises lies in Indigenous management, then the mechanism by which we achieve biodiversity is not through monitoring. It's through the management, it's through the implementation of Indigenous lifeways, their Indigenous knowledges in situ, through their contextual, their societal contextual applications that's going to really preserve biodiversity. So I always throw that out as a caution because we can throw a lot of economics at things that are not actually the mechanism by which the results are achieved. I sort of make this colloquialism, if you will. Biodiversity does not beget biodiversity. The mechanism by which we beget biodiversity is Indigenous management. So that's just a lot there. Never mind, James is going to show the video later. There's, who has heard of ethical space here? Okay, awesome. So this is excellent. So I just want to remind ourselves always, as I remind myself, at all scales and relationships from our interpersonal to our government-to-government relationships, that ethical space provides this framework that you can read more of through Reg Croshu and hear work. There's online webinars. We teach it in various things. These two main fundamental principles of ethical space, as I understand some of its import, is that one principle is to deeply understand what's important to be understood, right? And so that the Indigenous party in this case is responsible, as is Western society, of bringing forth what's important to be understood. So what you heard this morning is the bringing forth of what's important to be understood from these people who spend their lives really, really trying to understand it and bring forward that understanding. I wanted to bring forth a little of my own offering in terms of what's important to be understood about reconciliation, Indigenous worldview, legal pluralism here this morning. Oh, and the second premise is to create something new. Right, so we're in an exciting time, sort of based on understanding what do we create new. We are here at this conference calling for solutions. Those solutions need to be creative and something new. So I'll try to explain this in 9 minutes and 44 seconds. So this is really the offering I have into ethical space from an Indigenous perspective about what's important to be resolved, right? Reconciliation being the roots of conflict. How do we understand worldview and Indigenous perspectives? And so this, we talked earlier about law, and James and I were reflecting on law this morning as well, is about why do we behave the way we behave? Because we have laws to follow. Where do those laws come from? Right? And how do we embody those, the complacency with whatever legal system we're aligned to within our relationships? So this was born, this concept with my colleague Rob Edward, who's a Similkameen up in Canada. And we came back from a meeting disillusioned with the process of consultation where government was trying to meaningfully consult and said something along the lines, give us your values and we'll see if we can incorporate them. And consider them in our decision-making process. Whoops, now this is going backwards. Okay, that's my technical. So I'm not a millennial, obviously. Okay, no, oops, sorry. Okay, so there was a cool graphic that I was attempting to explain. We'll get that back online. But what we talked about was if we're trying to resolve things and we're looking for conflict, is there anything in common between the two societies, right? And so we talked about, indeed there is. Most societies on Earth have this conceptualization of a creator or a God, right? And I'm not speaking for all societies on Earth, but our understanding of how our societies became to be framed, many on the Indigenous side, and then certainly on the non-Indigenous. Okay, I'm gonna hold this button so I don't press anything else. So we have this, and so this is a lot of that happened. What's in common, right? We had the creation of all of the things on the earth, right? Both whether it's a Christian God or whether it's a Indigenous creator. This is typically sort of the process that we can see emerging how we understand the way we behave. So we go through this. So God created all the things, Creator created all the things, and a lot of stuff happened. And then there was the decision by the creators to create humanity, to create people, right? And so this is also the same. So the God and Creator created all the things on the earth, the water, the air, the trees, the animals, etc., and then decided to create humans, right? And so in the Christian context, we have the Creator create the humans and tell the humans essentially this notion that we understand as dominion, but could be viewed as stewardship, this responsibility to the earth, to caretake it or to use it, but essentially this idea that the decisions about what happens to the things on the earth are delegated to humans. So the essence of that message is humans have the ability to determine the fate not only of themselves, but also of the fate of the things on the earth, right? And so that's a little bit different from many different Indigenous perspectives, Cree, Okanagan, and others, to say when the Creator decided to create humans, he delegated the authority to the earth elements to make the decisions for the humans. So in the Okanagan context, Creator said, you animals get to decide whether these humans live or not. Right, so the animals had a caucus and said, indeed, luckily for the Okanagan, we agree to let them live and give of ourselves. And so this became a series of responsibilities and actions of reciprocity and obligation to those that allowed humans to live, that determined, the animals determined that the fate of the humans was to live, and there's a sense of obligations between the two. And so this is a fundamental inversion of our understanding of the arbiter of law, right? And so in the Western context, we're like, okay, well, we're going to make decisions about what happens on the earth and all the things on the earth. You can see this in the governmental application of decision-making processes such as environmental assessments, right? This fundamental question is that we want to see an outcome, say we want clean water, we're going to make a series of decisions, and we heard about theory of change. And so theory of change is the assumption that a series of human decisions will result in a system outcome. Since the arbiters of the law in many Indigenous contexts, including the Okanagan, is to say that the animals had said, this is the way things are going to be, right? And so the people's fate was determined by the animals. And so this is really, in essence, why we have my friend Steve Nita says 580, right? 5% of the world's population Indigenous controlling or managing territories where 80% of the world's biodiversity remains. It's because the decisions that the humans are making in the context of Indigenous societies are based on the higher arbiter of the law, the system outcome. So in the case of the Okanagan, for example, the water says, I must remain clean, right? And so then human decisions follow a higher order of law. So you have an inverse Western decision-making process. Human decisions influence system outcomes, right? And then you have, on the Indigenous side, system outcomes influence human decisions. And so when we're talking about the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge within policies and various things, we're talking about the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge within the realm here of policy and legislation making. And so this becomes a problem because when people think about the inclusion of those traditional ecological knowledge, all of that stuff that was told in those stories, through stories about the relationships and obligations, is traditional ecological knowledge. That's where it comes from. And when people attempt to say, okay, we're in our management plannings that are informed by science, we're going to include, incorporate, consider Indigenous knowledge within our management plans, we are then essentially misunderstanding the nature of traditional ecological knowledge, not only as a descriptor of ecological phenomenon, but also as the decision maker and the arbiter of law, right? So what happens, you take a conclusion of traditional ecological knowledge or story, try and pull it into here to include it into various nature-based solutions within corporate strategy. That's not anything sort of inherently wrong with it, but it subjugates the highest order of law to a policy validation feedback loop, right? And what happens in policy? We all know that, so-and-so got lobbied and there's consistency with other policy and we got no money and whatever, right? And so this essence of subjugation is at the heart of reconciliation, because the question becomes, why would any Indigenous nation want to do that? Why wouldn't any Indigenous person want to take their traditional ecological knowledge, their highest level of the law, and subjugate it to the vagaries of the policy validation process? So when we're thinking about reconciliation and understanding how this subjugation is at essence the problem within reconciliation, it's not because we have problems between the methodology of science, and you as scientists understand that, and the methodology of sort of seeing through the human lens what the animals are saying. Those conclusions are often very, very similar, right? But what you have is the ability of that information that's being drawn from the natural world to influence the way we behave without going through a human-centric decision-making or policy validation process. So what we're trying to reconcile is when we think about this, and there's the recent initiatives in beginning to build this understanding that we're really thinking about what is the same behavioral guidance that we're trying to get to in terms of law and human behavior, right? And so we have in Canada things like the National Parks Act, which says something along the lines of protect special places, right? So we're looking within the negotiations we're having about establishment of that park for the equivalent behavioral guidance within Indigenous story from that particular nation. So that happens to be Chickadee Arrow Story. And Chickadee Arrow Story says, we must preserve special places. So we're looking to get to the appropriate level. The Chickadee Arrow Story is not a story about chickadee management to be subjugated to various national park policy and management regimes, but a directive to the people that needs to be followed. So when we're thinking about reconciliation, we're thinking about this element, right? And I know less about the American political structure, but within Canada, this decision-making is really, this sort of human-centric decision-making is really clarified through various policy initiatives. So when we're negotiating that park, we're looking to those various laws. Canada, so here we would have a representative, Canada here, say. So Canada had said, we'd really like to have the Canadian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms in the document, right, in this MOU. So we just MOU for National Park Establishment or whatever. So, so we said, oh, that's great. How to be nice to each other and respectful and all this kind of sounds wonderful. We'll take a look at it. So that first line of that Canadian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms says, we believe in the supremacy of God. That's not a problem. There's still a supremacy of the Creator on the Okanagan side, without a doubt. The subtext to that statement is, we believe in the supremacy of a God who delegated decision-making to humans over the natural world. So that's not the same belief or in sort of Creator supremacy that in the Okanagans have. So this is really important because the Queen signed that, this human element as a representative of God, right? And then all of these things that fell out of that. So that document isn't in the agreement that we negotiated when we're talking about how we resolve conflicts because of that fundamental philosophical and law-based conflict between the two. So when we're thinking about reconciliation, we're thinking across a scale from, for example, saving patches of blueberries, working on a particular nature-based solution within a brownfield area or whatever the case may be. Those are important things to do and they can make a difference, right? But when we're thinking about Indigenous worldview, traditional ecological knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge here in the US, we're thinking about we cannot effectively have reconciliation without understanding these very, very inverse ways of thinking about arbiters of law within systems and whose law we follow. So when we're thinking, when we're trying to build solutions that say, well, bring us this millennia of beautiful knowledge about water systems, wouldn't that be wonderful for our decision making? Yes, it would, but it gets subjugated through this process. So I just suddenly got an extra minute. No minutes, okay. So I think, obviously there's a lot of these concepts, but my message to you in regards to this, when we're thinking about Indigenous knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, is that knowledge not only has sort of the ecological or scientific considerations and knowledge based on observations of Earth, whatnot, whether it's for 150 years or 15 millennia, but it's also about understanding that the behavioral directives from Indigenous knowledge are basically legal or law-binding agreements for Indigenous society. In order to reconcile, we're looking at reconciling the legal systems within our societies, not necessarily our understanding of applied ecology. I think I'll conclude with that, but also to say that this is important work, and it's going to take time, and these are tidbits of understanding that I began to share with you here. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. Hamidak yapi chanter washte nape chizapalo James Rattling Fimachapi na Sicangu Lakota Oyate Mataha. I greet you this morning from my heart with a handshake. I am known as James Rattling Leaf, and I am a member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe. And I'm happy to be with you here today to talk about these important topics, and an honor and pleasure to be invited by Jen and the whole Salazar Simple. I have a Ambassador Salazar story, but I'm not going to share it with you. How's that for a teaser? I like to tease, if that's okay with you. But today I was asked to speak on traditional knowledge and the work that I'm doing, and so that's what I'll do. is in the time I have is just share with you my work, and hopefully through the question and answer and the time I have with you here today and tomorrow, even though I'm not going to be here tomorrow, but it sounds good. But in any event, I am available. I am approachable to talk about the things that I'm talking about. So just know that. So let me begin by did I? Oh, okay. Great. So I want to talk about tribal colleges to begin with. I'm from the tribal college. This is St. Ecological University on the Rosebud Sioux Reservation. We're celebrating 50 years of existence, 50 years. And so we believe that we can tie higher education with our Lakota culture. So this is St. Ecological, the picture of the person here, and we honor him because of his forward thinking in terms of working with two ways of knowing. He saw the future when he went to Washington, D.C. in his time and said, we need to prepare our young people for a future that's different than that we grew up in. So we honor him, and we have these great values, right, of Lakota culture and Lakota value and Lakota thought philosophy. That's St. Ecological, and that's where I graduated from. And I worked there for 8 years, working on science and traditional knowledge. And so in that, to begin, I like this graphic because it begins to help us understand how we think about bringing in new things into our culture. So these are three men on a hill looking for the next campsite. You notice that they have tools, like a gun, and they're on horses, something that was brought to us. And so we are able to adapt to this change in our environment, change in our cultures, to incorporate these things. And so the question I had, with our elders is, how come we adopted the horse into our culture and we did not adopt the gun? But we made something about this, and that's why I think one of the important topics that we need to talk about is the importance of kinship. How does kinship play into our world, in our work, when we talk about the natural world and we talk about nature-based solutions? So when I talk about this, I talk to our people, our young people, about our ancestors and how they came to be and how they transitioned into a new world that they had to face. And so with that, then I have that, right? That's a satellite, right? And so it's another way of observing, it's another way of gathering information, another way of using information to help make decisions. So in that, this is the late Dr. Lionel Bordeaux, and he had this great quote. And when I started to advocate environmental data in terms of Earth observations, GIS data, and this is what he came up with to me. He said, James, this is kind of your mission statement, if you will. But the key point, again, is talking about how we connect the earth and sky and how we do that spiritually and technically. So I use this a lot wherever I talk, because this is where we came from. This is our approach of bringing in new things to our culture, to our university, to our curriculum, and to our work. And so because of that, we had to build partnerships. So when I was hired, I was asked to build this new lab, kind of like this fancy lab here at CSU Spur. Same thing. And so look at that young guy. This was in 2000. We did this signing, and I might not recognize him, but he's a pretty good-looking guy, if I may say. But we use this term Wolakota, and you notice in my introduction, I appropriated that word for my business name, because Wolakota is sort of akin to shalom. We aspire to be in relationship with one another in a good way. So we use Wolakota to sign this agreement with the USGS and to help support us technically. And this was really driven by the authority of the federal government directing federal agencies to work with tribal colleges. So on the top picture there, the man with the headdress is the late Albert Whitehat. And so I like that picture because I think it represents the connection to our past with the Wapaha, the eagle feathers, our culture today, but it also has that satellite imagery of the Rosebud Sioux tribe, Landsat 7. And I should have asked that question if anybody knew that with the data set, whatever. But then there was Chip Grote came to he was the director of USGS, and that picture is very powerful to me. His community was involved. And then that last picture there is, we had a leadership council. So this leadership council, half SGU, half tribe, and half USGS. And that's how we made decisions with this MOU. And then because of that, led us to this. So now that we talk about climate, I don't know if you know this, but I was part of the first National Climate Assessment, 1998-99. I was invited to a meeting like this, Atlanta, Georgia, 300 of the top climate scientists in the world. And you know what I got out of that meeting? There's a difference between the Hadley model and the Canadian model. Does anybody get that? Right? That's what I got out of that meeting because it was too much. They said all this stuff at us. Me and a couple other Indian guys were there, and we're sitting in the back of the room like this, and we're trying to understand why are we here. But you know, something important came out of that, something called the Native People, Native Homelands Initiative. And from that day on, there was always a chapter in the NCA of how we do that. And so because that we were there, because we advocated for inclusion into that report, it happened. And now we're on our 5th report, and I got to be a review editor for that chapter. And it was awesome to see the progress we made in terms of working with tribal knowledges and tribal people. So Rosebud then, my tribe, took the first step in developing a plan. And I just wanted to share these key recommendations. So one of the important parts of working with tribal governments is the governance of the tribal government itself. So the people who we interviewed for this plan said we need to focus on accountability. It was all about the tribal council and how they're going to be responsive to a changing climate, but also to the solutions. We had to protect the people. Remember I talked about those 3 men on the hill? You know, they're gathering information to come back to decision makers to protect the people. That was an important part of their assessment. And then we had to talk about water, the importance of water. We're in the hydro building. How appropriate. Tribes care about water, and so that was an important part of our plan. And finally, you know what? I'm all excited about this. I get to be part of building a whole new climate center on the Rosebud, serving the Rosebud, and bringing together traditional knowledge and climate data and science. So here's what we're going to do with the center. Lots of stuff. It's a 3-year project, about $2 million funded by the Bureau of Indian Affairs Climate Resilience Program. So we're talking about our lands, we're talking about management, we're talking about capacity with our staff, and we're talking about protecting our rights, our treaty rights. As you know, we know this, that tribal nations have a special responsibility or special relationship with the federal government, right? We're in the Constitution. Why is that? Well, we are. And so we want to see improved relation with the federal government and the tribes. There's a trust responsibility here that we need to adhere to, but also we need to strengthen and implement those things more and more. So we also want to think of ourselves as a collective, the Great Sioux Nation, Oceti, Sakowin. So this is a logic model of the work we've been doing for the past 5 years of trying to stand this up. And I want to make a point here. When we talk about climate change, we talk about working with our tribe, it begins at the family level, the Tokahe. And it goes all the way up to the Great Sioux Nation or the regional area. But these are things that are important to us. And I think when we talk about building partnership with tribal nations and their knowledges, you have to take this into consideration. What matters to us? Have you had those conversations? And can you have the trust to do that? We say that progress moves at the speed of trust. We don't talk about that very often, but it's fundamental. So, I know I'm at CSU grounds, right? It wasn't part of my introduction, but I work for CU. Full disclosure. I know Jen doesn't like me for that, but nevertheless, so I serve as a co-PI for the North Central Climatation Science Center as a co-PI. And in our proposal 6 years ago now, we said we're going to build a tribal climate leaders program at CU, and we're going to fund it. And we're going to fund it through fellowships. And we're going to fund 5. Guess how much that costed? Anybody guess here? Pretty close. Well, $675,000 to fund 5 students to get a master's degree at CU. This was 4 years ago. But this is what happened. A real person here named Will Crawford graduated with a Master of Science in Climate Science, and that's his quote. But I talk about him because when we talk about solutions, what does that look like from an Indigenous, well, it begins with people like him. We need to invest in our Indigenous students. If you follow the news on climate change around the world, you hear articles more and more about the importance of Indigenous youth engaging with climate change. The Nature magazine came out with a big one. The headlines, again, the future of climate change research has to include Indigenous youth. So here's a contribution I think that we need to look at. We need these kind of programs. We need to fund them. And so we're still working on to pick the next cohort. But it was a cohort, right? They all worked together. And this was during the COVID. So it wasn't ideal for us. But nevertheless, he and others. And I got to recruit him. So that required me traveling in the Great Plains area, going to meetings, going to conferences, going to workshops, and say, hey, I'm James Rattling. I'm from CU, and I want here to help you. No, I didn't say that. I said I said that we're looking for the next generation of travel climate leaders. Is there anybody here that wants to be one? You know, some hands said, tell me more, James. So, in this project, in this program, we deliberately recruited faculty as mentors for him that would recognize and honor traditional knowledge. He'll get the climate courses and research courses and do his research project, but we made space. We had to negotiate with some of our faculty at CU. If they didn't know about it, they had to learn about it. But this is equity. This is allow him to be himself, bring his whole self into the academy, and to be functional, but also to be honored and respected in what he knew. Not only what he had to learn there, but what he knew. And allowing that place and space to flourish. And that's what he did. So he did a study on Tumsala, which is a prairie tournament on his reservation. How is climate going to impact that? He's a great guy. And by the way, I got to share this. So when he graduated last May, his whole family came. Not just the immediate family, but when we say Tioshpai, that's your extended family, right? It's your aunts and uncles, and even grandma came. And what he did was what we call a giveaway in the Lakota culture. So he gave gifts to all his faculty and people who helped him along the way to get this master's. So we got to create spaces in places and organizations to allow these things. But what happens when you honor somebody, you honor people, is that they become closer. You become more of a relative in the work that needs to be done. Because it's hard work. You know that. And it's challenging work working with Indigenous people. We know that too from our side. We even have a hard time working with ourselves, let alone partners, let alone the Salazar Center, the International Salazar Center. Excuse me. So, also, we work in science organizations like ESA. Are there any ESA members here? Oh, good. Did everybody go to Portland? I'm looking at this later. Did you go to Portland? Oh, you didn't go to Portland. You should have been there. But did you know that I am your governing board member? So you could give me all your complaints. What's wrong with us? But I was elected. I think I'm the first Indigenous person to sit on the ESA governing board in the 40 plus years of it. And why does that matter, I think, in my mind? Well, I didn't grow up to want to be an ESA governing board member. I really didn't. But I learned something about something. It's kind of funny. But so they asked me to give a diversity speech 3 years ago to their organization virtually. And so if you know me, I laid out my best ideas. And I learned something, that you don't share your best ideas, because you know what? Someone might come back to you and say, James, can you help us with those ideas? So I give bad ideas now. No, I don't. No. But you look at that, right? So this is a webinar series. Look at all the topics here. This is a webinar series we did on TEK. This is open to you. You can go find it. You can go listen to it. And Dr. Bridge is also a part of that. You see her title there. That picture is the scholars we did at Montreal. And we attracted like I had 20 of them, right, Gwen? 20 come to us to Montreal to be with us. 2 days, we workshop in a room like this. And we talked about how do we bring TEK into ESA, into the curriculum and things like that. And that top is my baby. That's a squash. Does it look like a baby picture? But we did cultural night. So we invited the local elders in Montreal, the Haudenosaunee people and others came and spent an evening with ESA. Whole ESA was welcome. And I served as chair of the tech section at that time. And so the elder at the time, he brought me forward. He recognized me for the work that we did to bring them there, but also bring the good things there, the food, the music, the prayers. Boy, it was powerful, wasn't it, Gwen? And at the end, I wasn't expecting this, but he talked about food sovereignty and the importance of the seeds that grew that squash. And he told that story about it. Is that conservation? Is that biodiversity? is at TEK. But through the mode of storytelling, he connected all of us, and he gifted that to me. He said, "Jim, because you're leading this, I want to gift you a squash." And even though I couldn't take it back across the border, we got to change our border laws, right? So I can bring my squash back. But I asked Gwen to steward that for us, and so we're going to take the seeds from that, and we're going to share that with others. But that's where we want to move the organization. If I have a role as a board member for the next 3 years, we're working through a strategic planning process right now. We're going to see what we can do incorporating TEK, and then you can benefit from that. You can benefit by our organization going forward on these really difficult, challenging topics about TEK. And so we want you to be a part of that too. So I want to invite you again today to join ESA and come with us in Long Beach in August. And we're going to have tremendous TEK stuff again. And I think you're going to meet the scholars who are doing that really cutting edge work on TEK. We're running out of time. Also, this is a project that Gwen and I were asked to facilitate, tribal consultation. So that's terms you may know, right? Tribal consultation in America. How do you do that? So we were asked to do this. This is a beautiful picture of a new addition to the Wind Cave National Park. And so we were asked to help lead a meeting. But the National Park Service has an Indigenous director, Chuck Sams. And he's opening the door for more of these consultation and opportunities for tribes to work with national parks. So I'm a big believer in the importance of national parks and telling the tribal story, working in climate change, educating the general public. This is a picture of people we were invited to Shepherdson, West Virginia. I'm part of a project in the Department of Interior, elevating TEK and federal decision making. So we're developing a handbook, and we're developing associated training with that handbook. Every member of the Department of Interior is going to have access to working with TEK and the training associated with that. And I'm hoping that I get to be a part, continue to be a part of that. But we have a second draft of that. And to me, I've asked tribal leaders, is this handbook useful? Is it good? Can it help advance the understanding between TEK and us? And they say yes. So we'll keep going. You're invited to this, Wild 12. The Wild organization is going to work with my tribe, the Rose Tribe. We're going to host this meeting in the Black Hills of South Dakota next August. Isn't that cool? So tribes are coming together with the conservation groups, the wildlife groups, to work and advance. And so that's kind of cool. Come on. Somebody like clap or something, right? That's kind of cool, right? Because this is what I call boundary spanning. This is bringing someone like me into a science organization called CERES at CU Boulder to advance working with tribal nations. I started September 1st of this year. So I have some ideas of what we're going to do around TEK, partnership with tribes, in science and climate. That's cool. And next to my last slide here is, how do you view elders in your work? How do you view and respect knowledge holders in your work? This is the Lakota Studies Department who worked with me for the past 20 years to help me understand again my own tribe, my own people, my own knowledge, helping me understand what needs to be shared, what needs to be done, and how do we do that. Half of these people have passed on, have taken their journey. And why I talk about this is the importance of what they call intergenerational knowledge transfer. How do we do that among our own communities, our own cultures, but also among organizations? And I sort of made this thing up. I call it a leadership wellness check. Or do people care in your community and yourself as leaders in your organizations? How are you doing? I had this question from a young lady. She saw a talk like this I gave. She came up to me afterwards. How do you do all that? I said, I don't. I work in teams. I work in collaborations. I work with mentors. I work with folks that I think are greater leaders than me. And I work with people similar to me at that next level, that are kind of like me. Then I work with younger people, all three different levels. And so we interact with each other. We talk to each other. We share because we need that. Because the work is hard. You can burn out, and it does happen. But we got to take care of each other. And so that was my point. I said, How do we work with these guys within ourselves, but also cross boundaries, cross organizations? That's important. So as I conclude, I want to highlight again what Jen talked about, the Indigenous Engagement Institute, and we have this great video. So I want you to watch that right now.
There's too much at stake. Climate justice, equity, sustainability, all of these issues demand a better way to engage the land. All of these issues demand a better way of engaging the rightful keepers of the land, the Indigenous. But how? Learn in person from Indigenous voices like Gwen Bridge, James Rattling Leaf Sr., and other Indigenous experts.
How many civilizations have changed over the years, and ours is still the same. The stories are still the same. You know, maybe a little different from village to village, storyteller to storyteller, but the message is the same.
You know, now that we know these things, what are we going to do with it? It becomes our responsibility to practice it or share it or go deeper into those kind of things.
Get equipped to engage in ethical spaces, root out hidden biases, learn about Indigenous laws and more from the Indigenous perspective. Reform your viewpoint on Indigenous protocol and practice, experiencing firsthand Indigenous culture while being surrounded by the beauty of the land. Effectively engaging the Indigenous isn't only ethical, it is essential for all our relations, for our home and future generations. Register here today.
You know, to be honest with you, that kind of gives me goosebumps. Just watching that video, and I've seen it many times, because of where we're at right now as a society, as a world. We have this big problem, big challenge of climate change. And now in my 25 years of working, I've never seen so much interest now, and I think opportunity to work with Indigenous people in our traditional knowledge. That's the opportunity. What I showed you here was just a small sample, again, of other work. People are doing other work. It's just where I'm involved, and it's personal to me, and it's professional to me, and I think what a time now to do this work together with Indigenous people. So the Indigenous Institute is for us. It's for you. And the last images you saw, that's the Black Hills of South Dakota, where my homeland is, my traditional homeland. So with that, I want to say, hey, Chegala, that's enough. Wopi Latanka, Chichapalo, thank you all very much. Mi Danko ya Oyasi, all my relations.
All right, well, thank you for that. I think we have time for a few questions. So I'm going to start with the easy question. No, just kidding. I'm going to start with a hard question. Given all the work that both of you have done with different Indigenous nations and First Nations in Canada and the US, what have you experienced as some of the key barriers to incorporating more traditional ecological knowledge into climate and biodiversity work that you've been doing in different ways?
I think the desire to learn creates a real set of incentives which overlook the sort of more fundamental natures of Indigenous knowledge, like its authoritative legal context. So people get really excited about wanting to understand. So working with some scientists, and they say, well, we'd really like to understand traditional ecological knowledge. And I mean, that's a huge exercise. And in some of the longer trainings, thinking about the nature of understanding from a completely different frame of reference that, for example, may have different conceptualizations of math and physics and ecology and sap movement and all of these different kinds of things. So, you know, and I think that's our work, is trying to say, okay, well, how do we begin to take these baby steps to showcase the broader understanding of traditional ecological knowledge? It does have a lot of similarities, sort of methodologically, conclusion-wise, with science, but that depth of understanding takes a leap into trust, right? That these things are not metaphorical, they're not mythological, they're the actual truth, if we have any understanding of objective truth, which science believes it has, that exists within the Indigenous knowledge that's been here for so long. And so scientists always want to prove stuff, right? And this notion of ethical space and what we're talking about in terms of how we understand cross-validation of knowledges, that's an important because it builds understanding of scientists and others who are not trained or have a depth of knowledge to be able to understand what TEK means. But the question fundamentally, is that necessary? Right? When we think about the results we want to have achieved for climate and biodiversity, we know what produces those results now from our observations and understandings. And so we're making these leaps, right? We're trying to support that understanding which will enable those leaps with it for trust really to happen. So I have lots to say on that, but I'll stop there. Thanks.
You know, one of the things that I try to frame these things into really simple things for me, as I talk about the barriers working with TK and tribal folks, is I have these 4 R's, right? One is respect. You know, I think for so long as Indigenous people, our knowledges have not been respected. So that's a barrier. I think reciprocity, the second R, is another one. You know, it's moving from extractive to maybe generative or a better way. How do we change that? You know, in the university system, again, you know, researchers, I have this idea, I want to find a tribe, work with them, I want to work with the TK, you know, rather than saying, are the tribes asking you for that kind of work? Are they asking you for that research question? I think the third R is relational. What's your motivation to work with the tribes and their tribal knowledge? That begins with you. That's an assessment of you and your motivation. Why do you want to do this work in the first place? And really being honest with yourself. Is this really for the benefit of all of us, or is it for the benefit of you or your organization? You'll have to understand that, you know. And I think those R's, I think, are critical in terms of understanding and helping you get ready for that work. And then finally, my R is responsibility. You know, those elders that you saw in that picture, each one of them had a responsibility for what they knew and how they did that work among the Lakota people and even around the world, because our people are global people too, because we've been really open. We've been really open. If you know Lakota people in our culture, we know we're very open and we share a lot. A lot of tribes don't do that for their own reasons. But I think it's responsibility. Do you have the responsibility again? Do you have that sense of responsibility to what you know and what you learn, and be able to work with that within your own, whether it's your own team, yourself, your organization, and even the general culture? Then that makes it different, right? Then it's not just a nice thing to have, but you know, what do I do with this now? I'm responsible now for working with this knowledge and relationships that I've built.
So I'm going to take a question from the audience here from the Slido. And this is for Gwen, but I think it's applicable for both of you. Can you share some specific examples of how you've seen reconciling the ethical space work in practice? What can that look like on the ground? And then I have a little follow-up to that after you guys take your first step at that.
Sure. So it wasn't until 2021, I think, that Canada agreed to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and put that into legislation. British Columbia, where I currently live, followed suit with their DRIPA, Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. This concept of ethical space, while had been developed through Indigenous scholars for quite some time, Willie Ermine back quite a while ago, the University of Alberta first brought that in, and then followed by Reg, and then subsequently others, including Danica Littlechild. 2018, this concept of ethical space became sort of mainstream lexicon in terms of how we're going to achieve our Aichi Target 1, 17% conservation in Canada by 2020. So Parks Canada funded the Indigenous Circle of Experts to really describe the ways in which they felt that this would begin to work. And they brought forward and highlighted the concept of ethical space, which was a really great space. So within Canada, the conversations that are happening to build that deep understanding have begun. There's examples where they've achieved some things like commitments to national parks, for example. Some of the project for finance permanence in Canada, some of those projects I think are a result of gaining that deeper understanding. But that process of gaining deeper understanding and what it means for the changes that need to happen within that sort of policy and legislative framework are happening. And so we have examples coming forward like the inclusion of Indigenous languages within amendments to the Canadian National Parks Act, for example, are big steps which create sort of a feedback mechanism into that ethical space where we're saying, okay, we come out of these conversations understanding the changes that can be incrementally made. Right? When we talked about some of the White House stuff over 10 years, what are those incremental changes that we can make that reflect the understanding and these smaller shifts and transitionary steps towards the true reconciliation, which, as I mentioned, will take some time. So we're building a lot of momentum. We're really building that. I think we're in that phase of sort of building that deep understanding about, oh, what is it that we're trying to reconcile? What is it that we're trying to change? And then we're beginning to see some projects in conservation certainly come out, like South Okanagan National Park, Thai-Dene-Nene, and these PFP projects. So, yeah.
Oh, it's a good question. I think I have 5 responses to it. So the DOI handbook, we believe that ethical space will be part of that. So it'll be taught to and worked with the DOI department. That's pretty cool. Number 2 is series. One of my negotiation with them is that we're going to look at this ethical engagement framework and be a part of the institution. Number 3 is we have to rebid our CASC. And so CASC is a national network. And so we want to work with ethical space in terms of how we do engagement with science, with TEK, and tribal nations. Number 4 is that we were invited to do a webinar for the White House Office of Science, Technology, and Policy, talking about ethical space. And I think it had 200 or so leaders there. So, so it takes that, right? We're out there, we're approachable. I think we're available. And I think those things like that help build a greater understanding about these engagement frameworks that we needed. We want to make sure that they're linked again to, the what's happening, right? The Evidence Act. How many people know the Evidence Act here? The Evidence Act. That's a pretty big act because it's really an opening door in terms of policy and bringing in traditional knowledge and how we work with that. And so we've been talking with those folks again about the role of ethical space. So those are some specific examples where I think, and plus our workshop, right? We're going to be doing that. That's our commitment. That's part of the solution. There's not one arrow, right? We have multiple arrows. I'm not using the bullet one, right? There's not a silver bullet. There's not one silver arrow, but there are multiple arrows that's going to need to address that.
Well, we are sadly out of time for this session, but James and Gwen will both be here today, so I encourage you to find them at lunch and at the general reception this evening. Gwen and a different James will be also leading the Indigenous engagement breakout session that we have tomorrow. So there'll be more opportunities for those of you who attend that to dig into some of these topics. And I just want to say a giant thank you to both of you for being with us and sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us. Thank you so much.